Guys, I'm vaccinated, so I've been hanging out with people, which has been wonderful. And so for the last 2 weeks, I didn't post any videos, but I was listening a lot. Specifically, we talked about two things. One has to do with church, this ecclesiology thing. How do you determine what a good theology of church might be? But I've already talked about it quite a bit, so that's not our topic today. Our topic today, how do you theologize? Okay, so there are two things about that I will not get into now. Homiletics. I will not be talking about homiletics. That is how you're supposed to prepare a sermon and preach. And my main reason for that is simply that I do not consider homiletics to be either interpretive or theological, so it's a little bit hard to see why I would include it in this particular list. A list, by the way, that's going to consist of 5 different approaches, and I'm going to rank them, okay? The other one is what's called radical theology. And the reason I won't talk about that now in this connection is because it is, again, not interpretive in that sense like homiletics. In other ways, of course, it's completely different from homiletics. But it shares one thing with homiletics, and that is it is fundamentally non-interpretive. Now, you could argue that there are radical theologians who are interested in interpreting culture, and I respect that, and I know that. I know a bunch of them personally. But what I mean is on the theological side, on, if you will, the textual side, and you might say, why does theology have to be textual? Well, that's a matter of choice to some extent. Are you going to base it on something from the past or not? And radical theology, in many ways, does not base it on anything from the past. And consequently, at least that's one explanation, it is not super interested in interpretation. So there's something major missing there. But having said that, I think there are at least 2 radical theologians that I'm aware of that I have the greatest respect for. And whether I agree with them or not is another matter. Who cares? The point is, can we talk intelligently with each other? Can we shape each other? And so on. And they are Jeffrey Robbins and John Caputo. And then I know a lot of people who, they're very vociferous and they're out there and they come up with all kinds of ideas and whatnot. And I can't really get into like Pete Rollins, for instance. I met him once, and he's a cool guy in many ways, but that is not my thing. Mostly, again, because it is fundamentally non-interpretive. If you look at his, for instance, what he calls pyrotheology, he does his thing, period. Okay, I need more. I need something, and the something needs to be somewhat palpable. I don't find that the case with someone like him. But in any case, so I'm not going to go there either. So what are the 5 then that I'm going to mention? And I'm going to start at the bottom. So think of it as a bit of a dumpster dive. Here we go. At the very bottom, apologetics. Now, for some people, that is a huge thing. It is a huge theological approach. For me, it is not really a theological approach, but more fundamentally, it is not interpretive. 2 of the main reasons why I consider apologetics fundamentally non-interpretive is, first of all, it goes after questions that ostensibly can be answered in an either-or kind of way. Either they're right or they're wrong. Well, maybe you allow a little bit of tweaking, but there's very little gray. There's a lot of black and white. It assumes that by getting something right on the level of, cognitive ascent or getting it wrong on the level of cognitive descent, you will be transformed one way or another. And the reality is you will not. Agreement with something does not transform people. What transforms people is if there's some tension, if there's a conceptual space where people are different and yet they meet and they affect each other. But that is not apologetics. So apologetics is at the very bottom of my list. I'm personally not interested in it. The next one up from there is dogmatics. In Warehouse Theology, I was just doing a little thing on dogmatics where I took a major source book on dogmatics, and it has something like 14 chapters maybe. And they're highly systematic. Of course, they come with the Latin chapter headings. And the way it works, everyone starts with off, like off God, off sin, off this, of that, and so on. Now, it so happens that in that class in Warehouse Theology, we've been interpreting and we've been interpreting parts of Mark's Gospel. So it occurred to me that it would be fun to put them next to each other and to see if any of the questions that the Dogmatics book thinks are important, as indicated by the chapter titles and the subheadings and everything, if any of them actually matter to a biblical author. And the answer is they really don't. I mean, on a very superficial topical level, you could say, yes, it's somehow about God, it's somehow about Jesus, and so on. But that is irrelevant. That is just superficial. The reason they don't match up is, again, that dogmatics, like apologetics, is essentially non-interpretive. So in that particular book, which is very widespread and well-known and used in seminaries a lot, in that particular dogmatics book, for instance, there isn't even an index of biblical passages. And yet, the book claims at the front end that somehow this dogmatics, the dogmatic framework that is being espoused here, arises from the Bible. But no effort is made, and apparently that is considered okay, to show any kind of connection between the two. Okay, well, dogmatics essentially has a history of serving the institution and is not super interested in being challenged by any texts. Number 3, for me, is systematic theology. Systematic theology is a little bit better than dogmatics. I mean, fundamentally, it's also from the top down, which I don't like. It's not that as humans, we can not be top down. No, we cannot. We are always in some ways top down, by which I mean we always have big ideas that constitute life for us, or that constitute our filters through which we perceive life. But then we look at a text or at each other or a situation, and we try and interpret it, which I would consider, or I would describe as bottom up. The fact is, we're always doing a little bit of both, or a lot of both. We have to. The question is, how do we do it? And how do we allow the two to intersect with each other? Now, the thing with systematics is it prioritizes the top-down approach. Now, you might look at a systematic theology and you're going to find this index at the end there with biblical passages and so on. But when you go there and you look up those verses, very often you're going to be struck by the fact that they essentially have nothing to do with what is being claimed in the text, the biblical text in this case. And that is troubling to me. It is not as non-interpretive as the other two that I mentioned, but it's kind of going that way a little bit. It is not as much a sellout to the institution as dogmatics and apologetics too, to some extent, but it's leaning that way. You are now supposed to agree with certain theological traditions more than other traditions. You're supposed to be a Calvinist as opposed to any number of alternatives. It does have a habit of bifurcating everything. Systematic theology does. So you end up with these polar opposites a lot, like the one I just mentioned, Arminian versus Calvinistic. Now, personally, I'm neither one nor the other. I think they're both based on assumptions that are not tenable ultimately. Now, that's my personal opinion, and we can talk about that in the context of another video. But it's important to me that not only do you have this polarizing going on, as well as some institutional connections in the sense of let's say if you wanted to teach in certain seminaries, you have to sign certain statements of faith and so on. But the other thing, like I said with apologetics, it cannot transform. Systematics doesn't transform anyone. It just presents you with something, with which you are invited to engage by assenting to it. And the other piece is it tends to make philosophical assumptions and carry them into the Bible that may not at all be appropriate to the Bible. Example, a dualistic understanding of heaven up there and earth here. That is not a biblical understanding. The Bible is far less obsessed with up there and the future than we often are. It's far more interested in real life and in the here and now. And systematics tends to have a hard time with it. Okay, number 2. Biblical theology. Now, biblical theology, I would say, is a lot better than the other three that I mentioned, in the sense that it actually asks the Bible, what are you doing? What are you doing? What kind of impact do you want to have on me, on us, and so on? Now, that's a very good thing. My concern with biblical theology is interpretive. It is not so much one of epistemology in general, but interpretation in particular. Here's what I mean, and I said this in another video. It is so tempting when you have 66 books of the Bible together in one Bible, and Bible happens to be the word that means book in Greek. It is very tempting to then take those 66 documents and treat them as chapters of one book. But actually, you've kind of destroyed them at this point. You've relegated them. You've devalued them. And that is the big problem with biblical theology, to my mind. So if you even start positively in the sense of asking the text, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to do? That's always the better question. What are you trying to do than what are you trying to say? Even if you start like that, then you often end up in a situation where some of those books become dominant because you know more about them, about their content, their circumstances, and so on. And then you kind of take whatever arises from that dominance and you subject the other texts to it. And if they don't have anything to say to those particular issues, then they just simply don't feature very much in your biblical theology. And we see that a lot. There are a lot of books in the Old Testament that never get much of an airing, really, in Christian circles for that reason. So that is my concern, but it is far better than the other three that I mentioned. My number one would be, and it doesn't have a label as such, but my number one would be when you take each book on its own, like they were written, like they were disseminated at the time, and you take the text seriously on its own and you ask about the implied author of each text, the implied author, not the empirical author, because otherwise we're in trouble because we don't know. And I said in another video, even if we did know, we couldn't go back and interview them. And even if we could interview them, they would still be fellow interpreters now of their own work, now that their work has been complete and published. So we would take each book seriously on its own. We would ask, who's the implied author and the implied audience? The two always match up. Implied author, implied audience. If something is written like it's trying to teach something, the implied author is a teacher, the implied audience is a student, okay? So we ask that kind of question. We ask, what's your story? We ask the narrative piece. Tell me the story that you're interacting with and how you're bringing your story, you, the book, and the story of the people you have in mind and how they are kind of hitting each other or, running into each other, causing a little bit of an explosion, which means transformation. The way human beings are transformed is by experiencing narrative explosions, essentially. And again, something we should talk about some more sometime. So those are the kinds of questions you're going to ask. And of course, the one I already mentioned, which is, what are you doing? Speech as action. Hey book, how are you acting upon the original audience, and how, by way of me imagining myself into their shoes and into the shoes of you, the implied author, how am I being acted upon? Those are the kinds of questions. If you ask that, you are interpreting. And you know what? Personally, I think it's better to interpret and make mistakes than not even to interpret. And that's my big problem with those other approaches that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So I'm hoping that this is bringing a little bit of clarity to the situation. I'd love to hear from you in terms of you either defending one of the other approaches or asking more about this one that I just mentioned. Either way, it'll be good to hear from you.